You're standing in a marketplace. It's 2000 BC. The sun is brutal. The smell is overwhelming. Animals, sweat, rotting fruit, spices so strong they make your eyes water. And somewhere in the back, past the grain merchants and the copper traders and the woman selling live geese, there's a guy. Unremarkable. He has a small clay jar sealed with bitumen. He's not advertising. He doesn't need to. His customers already know where to find him. And what he's selling is worth more than silver, more than grain, more than almost anything else moving through this market today. What's in the jar? Opium. And this isn't some underground black market operation. This is trade. Legal, documented, internationally organized trade. The ancient world ran on drugs. Not metaphorically, not as a joke. Literally. The first global trade networks, the ones that connected civilizations thousands of miles apart, were built in significant part around the movement of psychoactive substances. And almost nobody talks about it. Here's what you were probably taught. Drugs are a modern problem, a symptom of industrial excess, moral decay, the pressures of contemporary life. The ancient world was pure, stoic, sober. People worked the land, prayed to their gods, fought their wars, and went to bed without chemical assistance. That version of history is almost completely wrong, and the actual version, the real one, is so much more interesting and so much more uncomfortable that it explains things about human civilization you probably never expected to understand. Let's start at the beginning, because before you can have a drug trade, you need two things. You need drugs, and you need trade. And the question of which came first is genuinely one of the most fascinating arguments in archaeology. Some researchers believe long-distance trade routes developed specifically to move psychoactive plants. Not spices, not metals, drugs. The demand was so consistent, so urgent, so reliably profitable that it pulled trade networks into existence around it. Other researchers argue trade networks developed for other reasons, and drugs just moved along with everything else. But here's what everyone agrees on. By the time the historical record begins, anywhere in the world, the movement of consciousness-altering substances across vast distances is already happening. It was already established, already organized, already ancient by the time anyone thought to write it down. The oldest documented drug trade we have direct evidence for involves opium, and the story starts in the ancient Near East, specifically in what is now southern Turkey and the Levant, around 3500 BC. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, was being cultivated deliberately at this point, not gathered wild. Cultivated, farmed with intention, and the resin extracted from its seed pods, raw opium, was being moved in distinctive ceramic vessels. Small, elegant juglets with a particular shape, a narrow neck, a round body, slightly pointed at the bottom. They look, and this detail is genuinely not a coincidence, almost exactly like an inverted opium poppy seed pod. Archaeologists call them base ring ware juglets, and they show up everywhere. Cyprus, Egypt, the Levant, Greece, Turkey. They've been found in palace storerooms, in tombs, in temple complexes, in merchant warehouses. And when researchers tested the residue inside them, they found exactly what the shape implied. Opium alkaloids. These weren't decorative containers. They were the ancient equivalent of branded pharmaceutical packaging. The shape told you what was inside before you even opened it. That's not primitive. That's sophisticated commercial signaling. That's branding 3,500 years ago. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC wasn't just importing opium. They were importing it in enormous quantities. The Ebers Papyrus, the same ancient medical document we talked about earlier from around 1550 BC, contains over 700 medical prescriptions, and a significant number of them include opium as an active ingredient. They called it SPN, rendered approximately as Shepin. They used it for pain relief, for sleep disorders, for quieting crying children. That last one should probably make you deeply uncomfortable from a modern perspective, but let's table the parenting norms of Bronze Age Egypt for a moment. The point is this: opium wasn't fringe, it wasn't underground, it was listed in the official medical text of one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. It was imported, stored, and distributed through official channels. It was medicine, regulated, prescribed, administered medicine, and the supply chain that kept Egypt stocked required organized international trade across hundreds of miles of sea and land. But opium is just one thread. Pull at it, and the whole tapestry starts unraveling in ways that should fundamentally change how you think about the ancient world. Let's talk about the Silk Road, because most people think of the Silk Road as being about silk. It's right there in the name. name. The Silk Road moved silk. That's the story. Except the name Silk Road wasn't coined until 1877. It was invented by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. The people actually traveling those routes didn't call it that. They didn't have a single name for it because it wasn't a single road. It was a web of thousands of interconnected routes spanning from China to the Mediterranean. And what moved along those routes? Everything. Silk, yes, but also spices, ceramics, glassware, horses, ideas, religions, disease, and drugs. Enormous quantities of drugs. Cannabis moved westward from Central Asia. Opium moved in multiple directions at once. Henbane, a powerful hallucinogen in the same family as belladonna, was traded across Europe and Asia for thousands of years. Khat, a stimulant plant native to the Horn of Africa, has been found in archaeological sites across the Arabian Peninsula and into Central Asia. These weren't incidental cargo. In many cases, the psychoactive substances were among the highest value goods per unit of weight being moved along these routes. And high value per unit of weight is exactly what makes something worth trading across 1,000 miles of desert and mountain. Here's something that should reframe your entire mental image of ancient trade. When you imagine a Bronze Age merchant crossing the Mediterranean, loading cargo onto a ship in Cyprus, sailing to Egypt, what are you picturing as the most valuable thing in that hold? Gold maybe, copper, tin, the metals that made weapons and tools. Those were valuable, but opium, pound for pound, was worth more. And unlike metals, it was consumed. It was used up. The demand was constant, repeating, self-renewing. A merchant who sold copper once. A merchant who sold opium to the same physician in Alexandria created a customer who needed more opium next season, and the season after that, and the season after that. The economics of addiction, even medically managed addiction, created a different kind of commercial relationship. One that looks very familiar if you understand how modern pharmaceutical supply chains work. Let's talk about cocaine, because here's where the story gets truly wild. In 1992, a German toxicologist named Svetla Balabanova was testing mummies from the Egyptian Museum in Munich. Routine work. She expected to find what you'd expect to find in 3,000-year-old human remains. What she found instead caused an immediate controversy that is still not fully resolved. She found cocaine and nicotine in 9 Egyptian mummies dating to approximately 1000 BC. Cocaine and nicotine, both of which come from plants that are native to the Americas. Coca leaves, the source of cocaine, are indigenous to South America. Tobacco, the source of nicotine, is indigenous to the Americas. There was no possible known trade route that should have connected South America to ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago. Columbus didn't arrive in the Americas until 1492. That's 2,500 years after these mummies lived. The scientific community's initial response was essentially controlled skepticism bordering on outright rejection, contamination, laboratory error, methodological problems. But Balabanova tested again and again. She brought in additional researchers. She tested additional mummies from different collections. The results held. Other laboratories confirmed them. The cocaine and nicotine were real. So what does that mean? There are a few possibilities, none of them comfortable. 1. There was a pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas that we have not yet fully documented, and that transported these plants across the Atlantic. 2. There are plants native to the Old World that contain the same chemical signatures as cocaine and nicotine, and we haven't identified them yet. 3. The contamination explanation, while tested and retested, is somehow still the answer. Most mainstream archaeologists land on version 2 or 3, but the fact that this data exists and remains unexplained after 30 years of scrutiny should at minimum make you curious about what ancient trade routes we still haven't mapped. The ancient world was larger and more connected than our historical maps suggest. We know this from other sources, we just can't always explain the specific mechanism, and the cocaine mummies are the most spectacular unresolved example of that gap. Let's move to something less contested but equally remarkable: the ancient Greek and Roman relationship with drugs. Because this is another place where the mythology of sobriety collapses spectacularly on contact with the actual evidence. Greek wine was almost never consumed pure. The Greeks considered drinking undiluted wine to be a sign of barbarism, uncivilized, something Scythians did. Wine was mixed with water and frequently with other things: herbs, resins, spices, and quite possibly psychoactive additives. Various ancient texts referred to wines with specific properties, wines that produced particular kinds of altered states. Wines that were used specifically in religious ceremonies, and that produced effects beyond ordinary intoxication. The kykeon, the ritual drink consumed during the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most important religious ceremony in ancient Greece, is a case that scholars have been arguing about for decades. Some researchers, including Albert Hofmann, the chemist who first synthesized LSD, proposed that kykeon contained ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains compounds chemically related to LSD. The Eleusinian Mysteries were attended by virtually every significant figure in ancient Athenian and later Roman society. Plato went, Aristotle went, Cicero went, Augustus went. These were not fringe events. These were the central religious experiences of some of the most influential people in Western history, and they may have involved a psychedelic drink as the core ritual technology. Think about that the next time you read Plato's descriptions of transcendent reality. Meanwhile, Rome, the pragmatic administrators of the ancient world, ran a pharmaceutical trade that would be recognizable today in its basic structure. Roman physicians prescribed opium for everything from surgery to insomnia to anxiety. The emperor Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher who wrote Meditations, took theriac daily. Theriac was a compound pharmaceutical preparation that contained, among many other ingredients, opium. The man who wrote extensively about enduring hardship and cultivating inner peace was, by modern standards, physically dependent on opioids. History does not always provide the narratives we expect, but let's go even further back because there's a piece of this story that almost nobody talks about, and it's the most important one: cannabis. Not as a modern recreational substance, as the cargo that helped build the first Eurasian trade networks. The cannabis plant is native to Central Asia. Archaeological evidence of cannabis use as fiber, as food, and as a psychoactive substance dates back over 12,000 years in Taiwan and across the steppes of Central Asia. By 3000 BC, cannabis was being cultivated across a vast geographic range stretching from China to the Indian subcontinent to the Middle East. And it was moving. The Yamnaya people, the semi-nomadic steppe herders who are now understood to have had an enormous genetic and cultural impact on both Europe and South Asia, were moving cannabis westward as they expanded across the continent. When Herodotus describes the Scythians in their hemp smoke tents, he's describing what was by that point an already ancient tradition. The Scythians weren't early adopters. They were custodians of something that had been moving across Eurasia for thousands of years before them. Cannabis was traded because it was everything at once. It was fiber for rope and cloth. It was seed oil for cooking and lamps. It was medicine, and it was a way to alter consciousness in a world where altering consciousness was frequently understood as a path to the divine. One plant, multiple markets, simultaneous demand, a logistical dream for any ancient merchant with access to supply. Now let's slow down for a moment, because there's a question underneath all of this that's worth sitting with. Why? Why did the ancient world trade drugs so extensively? Why was demand so consistent, so geographically widespread, so economically powerful that it shaped trade networks across continents? Part of the answer is medicine. In a world without modern pharmaceutical options, plant-based psychoactive substances were the most effective pain management tools available. Opium genuinely works. Cannabis genuinely works. Henbane in the right dose genuinely works. These weren't placebos or superstitions. They were functional medicines that addressed real suffering, and their effectiveness was empirically demonstrated over thousands of years of use. Part of the answer is religion. Altered states of consciousness were, in virtually every ancient culture, understood as a technology for accessing the divine. The shaman, the priest, the oracle, the initiate, the religious specialist who could travel between worlds was the most important person in a community, and the substances that facilitated that travel were sacred commodities, not recreational distractions. Part of the answer is social. Shared consumption of mind-altering substances is one of the oldest known methods of building group cohesion. We've covered this before in a different context, but the principle applies here at a civilizational scale. When trade partners share a ritual substance, trust deepens. When soldiers share a medicinal compound before battle, fear diminishes. When a community shares a religious experience facilitated by a psychoactive plant, their collective identity strengthens. These substances were social infrastructure, tools for building the kinds of human relationships that civilizations depend on. And part of the answer is simply the same answer that explains every other durable trade good in history. People wanted it, consistently, reliably, urgently, and where there is consistent urgent demand, supply finds a way. It always does. Here's the uncomfortable part. The ancient drug trade was, in most of the contexts we've described, not a shadow economy. It was not criminal. It was not shameful. It was part of the legitimate commercial and medical and religious infrastructure of ancient societies. The moralizing around drugs is not ancient. It is surprising surprisingly recent. The idea that psychoactive substances are inherently dangerous, inherently corrupting, inherently worthy of criminalization. That framework is mostly a product of the last 2 centuries. Before that, the question wasn't whether you used mind-altering substances. Everyone did. The question was which ones, for what purpose, in what context, under whose guidance. The ancient world had sophisticated answers to all of those questions. They weren't always right. They made mistakes. They misunderstood toxicology. They accidentally killed people with incorrect doses. But the framework was not prohibition. The framework was management, ritual, purpose, context. What changed? Several things happening more or less simultaneously in the 18th and 19th centuries. The rise of industrial chemistry, which allowed active compounds to be isolated, concentrated, and made far more potent than anything available in plant form. The mass market commercialization of substances like tobacco, opium, and alcohol by companies whose economic interest lay in maximizing consumption. Colonial dynamics in which substances used by colonized peoples were often criminalized partly as a means of social control, and religious and moral reform movements that reframed intoxication as a sin rather than a tool. The combination produced something the ancient world never really had, a global prohibition mentality, and it produced the modern drug trade. Not the ancient one, the modern one, the underground one, the one with cartels and trafficking and mass incarceration and all of the violence and suffering that follows from pushing an unkillable demand into the shadows. The ancient drug trade was managed through cultural, religious, and commercial frameworks. The modern drug trade is managed through criminal law, and the results of those 2 approaches are, from a public health perspective, not even close. Here's the thing that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. Every civilization that has ever existed on this planet has had a relationship with psychoactive substances. Every single one, without exception. No archaeologist has ever uncovered a complex human society that showed no evidence of mind-altering substance use. The relationship is universal. It is older than agriculture. It may be older than language. The drive to alter consciousness, to step outside ordinary perception, to find the edges of the mind is not a modern weakness or a cultural pathology or a failure of moral character. It is one of the oldest and most consistent behaviors in human history. The ancient drug trade wasn't a footnote. It was infrastructure. It was medicine. It was religion. It was diplomacy. It was economy. It connected civilizations that we used to think had no contact with each other. It funded empires. It moved along the same routes as silk and silver and ideas and disease. It built the world that built the world you're living in, and almost nobody talks about it. The guy with the clay jar in the ancient marketplace, the one sealed with bitumen, the one shaped like an opium poppy pod. He wasn't an outlaw. He wasn't a criminal. He was a merchant meeting a demand that stretched back further than civilization itself. He was, in every sense that mattered to his world, ordinary. That's the part that should stay with you, not the drugs, the ordinariness of it. Because the gap between how the ancient world understood these substances and how the modern world understands them is not a gap produced by knowledge or science or progress. It's a gap produced by a very specific set of historical decisions made in the last 2 centuries by people with very specific economic and political interests. And those decisions are still shaping your world right now in ways you probably haven't fully mapped. The clay jar is still there. The question is, who gets to decide what's in it?